Hello and welcome to Saxworks Online. I'm Rachel Sklar, VP of Programming and Content here at Saxworks, or I guess in spirit here at Saxworks since we're on Zoom and I'm in my home, although I am surrounded by the famed, or maybe infamous, depends who you're asking, Saxworks plants. And for those of you who are joining and have previously joined some of our online sessions, you will recognize Planty, our Zoom mascot. Regardless, we are here with Saxworks, a new membership club, co-working space, and just overall place that is meant to support you and your wellness journey and your goals for 2022, your goals for wellness, your goals for mental improvement, your goals for connection, community, and whatever it is you're looking to do for 2022, because it's a brand new year. So many opportunities to get out there and have fun. Wait, I'm hearing that the opportunities to get out there per se might be a bit abridged at the moment. Please be safe. Yeah. Entering year 3 of COVID requires, I guess, a little bit of mordant humor, or maybe not, depend on who you're asking. Without further ado, when we're talking about mordant humor, I can't think of two women who I'd rather talk to about events in the 80s, 90s, aughts, 2010s, whatever we're calling them, and taking a gimlet eye on how we viewed these pop cultural events in the past, particularly with respect to women and the biases that culturally we have all grown up with and are now trying to grow out of. Then Jessica Bennett and Susie Banikarim, both two pop culture mavens and crack journalists. I'll give you a brief bio, but you should definitely follow them both and look them both up. Jessica Bennett, I call her Jess, was the first ever gender editor of the New York Times. She is also an editor at large there at the moment. You may recognize her byline from profiles of Monica Lewinsky, Amanda Knox, Kate Baer, and Jessica also moderated our talk with Kate Baer earlier this year. And she is the author of Feminist Fight Club. Really, you should really follow her and her observations. And her adventures out in California during the off season, if she'll let you on the gram. And Susie, you will notice in the background, Susie's brand new Emmy, one of two, recently arrived, Pride of Place, for the documentary that came out, Enemies of the People, right? That's what it's for? Okay.
No, actually, I'm sorry. These Emmys are actually for Vice News Tonight. Sorry.
Oh. Sorry, that was just Emmy nominated.
Easy to mix them up.
Yeah, that's right.
So many Emmy nominations. It's really hard to figure
little time.
I get the statue for, but Susie's very impressive by way of Vice News, The Daily Beast. Really, if you follow her on Twitter, she does not suffer fools. I believe my first interaction with her was I was the fool that was not being suffered. So I'm always very grateful.
I remember that.
Okay, we'll talk about that. It's all good. It's all good. This is the thing. For me, interacting with amazing women in my field is a constant learning experience and ups my game at all times. So who knows where I'll be at the end of this incredible panel. We are talking about how to re-look at, re-examine, re-experience, and recontextualize some of these pop culture events that seem so normal and natural to be conveyed to us through the lens of, say, Matt Lauer interviewing Britney Spears. And we have opportunity to rethink that now. So I'm just going to go right to you, Jess, and talk about this latest trend of re-examining these stories. That's kind of your thing. So,
I know you should be getting way more residuals.
Listen, it's very early in 2022. I expect to see an Emmy behind you the next time we
Thank you.
Tell me about it. Like what, I guess on a personal level, what drew you to retelling these stories for now?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I initially thought of it as retelling. But for me, this began back in, I don't remember, 2013, maybe, when Monica Lewinsky wrote a piece for Vanity Fair. It was the first time she'd really spoken publicly in about a decade about what had happened to her since the Clinton affair. And I became obsessed with understanding and looking at how she was portrayed at that time. I had basically grown up on that scandal. I was in high school. I like distinctly remember staying by the lockers with my friends, like poring over the Star Report like it was pornography. Because it was,
Yeah.
but published in Newsweek, where I would then go on to have my first journalism job. And not really understanding or being able to contextualize at that age what it meant that the president was having an affair with a 21-year-old intern and how she was being portrayed in the media. And so over the course of 2 years, I had these conversations with Monica. I reached out to her and sort of made this case about why I wanted to do a profile of her and why I believed that I could treat her fairly and could really look at her story through the nuance and lens of modern day. And it took 2 to 3 years of convincing, but she finally said yes. And I published this profile in the New York Times. This was before I was on staff there, but it, for me, sparked open this idea of looking back at some of these cases that I had grown up on and that had taught me so much, I think, about women's place in the world, who I was, how the media reflects women in society, but only recently had really began to understand. And as you know, since then, we're seeing this occur left and right. I think just the other day I was saying to Susie, there's a new documentary out about Pam Anderson and Tommy Lee. There's another one called Reframing Marilyn Monroe. Many people just watched the Beatles, the epic Beatles documentary, which had a lot in there about Yoko Ono. There was the documentary about Woody Allen. I mean, on and on and on. Susie, what am I forgetting?
I mean, I feel like, right, the obvious one is the one that feels like it sort of kicked off the moment, which is the Framing Britney Spears doc that the New York Times did. That's when people sort of start to coalesce around this as an idea that was sort of like thematic, right? And so now we're seeing everybody do that. I mean, I think one thing that we all sort of know about journalism and television is that the minute someone does something that works, everyone tries to copy it. So it sort of does feel like a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon. I think what's kind of interesting about Jess's work and why we sort of developed this project is that often it feels like these the idea of retelling or reframing is kind of interesting because in a lot of these cases, these women never got to tell their own stories, right? I mean, that's partially what it is. Like they're getting to tell their own stories for the first time. And in some cases, it's not even them, right? Like Britney didn't participate in the New York Times piece. She has criticized it. Alanis, they just did that Alanis documentary. She criticized it. So it's also, what's interesting is also that there's this thing going on where, there continues to be this sense from women that their stories don't always get told in the way that they want. And that's always going to be a tension, right, with storytellers and the people they cover. But I think one of the reasons we wanted to look at this in a slightly different frame for the podcast is that what we're trying to get at is that it's not necessarily like about these women, and it's not about us telling you what their stories are. It's about what we took away from their stories and the way their stories were told, right? So sort of these moments that we all witnessed, right? We saw what happened to Monica, and as girls, we didn't think of her as that young, right? At least me, I was like, what? She's like 21. Like that's totally an adult age. Like she's an adult who it makes total sense that like everyone is treating like an adult, right? But when you think about it now, like what lessons did we take away from watching that girl be treated, like sort of talked about like a slut, and like her weight was like a huge thing. Like she wasn't like attractive enough to be worthy of his attention. And also, what did we take away about sort of like what it meant as a woman to operate in the world, where if something bad happened between you and a man, the man could go on and be forgiven and become sort of like a hero, and you would basically just be shoved to the sidelines. And she spent years trying to recover from it, right? So I think what we're trying to get at is not just the retelling of the stories, but also really getting at what they do to us to sort of absorb them and what we take away from them.
I think what's interesting and what both of you have just said too is it's flashing me back to how I took in these stories, and the narrators were overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white men, powerful men. I'm really thinking about like the through line of Jay Leno as a person who through who these stories were then retold. I mean, it's shocking now to think of what the things that he said about so many young women, but to a lesser extent too, like David Letterman, Saturday Night Live, like there's that too is part of the pop culture telling. So it's all super fascinating.
I think what's particularly interesting about that piece is one thing we've noticed that Jess and I laugh about a lot is that if you scrape the surface of almost any of these stories, there's a man who has since been sort of outed as being problematic. Like, let's look at David Letterman. David Letterman eventually did also sleep with one of his interns, also a woman who was widely skewered for not being attractive enough to have been worthy of his attentions. And if you look at the Britney Spears interview, one of the sort of famous Britney Spears interviewed by Matt Lauer, who at the same time was, as we now know, sexually assaulting women. And I think Jess brings up the Janet Jackson.
Yeah, well, Janet Jackson, that infamous moment where she flashed her nipple on screen, or Justin Timberlake flashed her nipple on screen.
It was there was the wardrobe malfunction.
Yeah, the wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl. And she was basically, banned from performing at future Super Bowls while Justin was not. And then, in fact, her music, she was releasing a new album, ceased to be played on many of the networks that were associated with that one. Who was running those networks? Les Moonves, now fired, known sexual assaulter. Yeah. So it is interesting. Yes, you peel back the layers a little bit, and you don't have to look that far to find some figure that we now know through modern eyes was doing bad things.
I think it is actually important not to say that this is like a distinguishing thing that helps people in the lower levels, but when you get to that level too, it's not just, I'm saying just that they were overwhelmingly terrible abusers of power. It's just the level to which the degree to which they abused that power, that there were structures created to support that abuse of power, and that it permeated everything. When you're talking about Matt Lauer, it's not only that his behavior was so inappropriate. It was the extremeness of the inappropriate behavior, the infamous lock the door button, and the way that clearly, in retrospect, permeated the way that he conducted these interviews. And then when you're talking about Les Moonves, I mean, he cut down Linda Bloodworth Thompson, the creator of Designing Woman, because he did not like her, right? Yeah. There were, Ileana Margulies, her career stopped in its tracks because she rejected his advances. That's, her story. You hear more of these. And even when you're talking about David Letterman, Nell Scavalla, a mutual friend of Jess and ours, she wrote a piece, which I remember it was very impactful to me to read it in 2009 after the Letterman news came out, also saying, I worked there and I was, one of very few women. And this was a cultural thing long before this scandal emerged. And it only emerged because Letterman came clean because he was being blackmailed, right? Quite a trip down memory lane.
But I think also part of what you're talking about is that we were surrounded by this. At least, I know, Jess, you knew, at Newsweek, there was a lot of this kind of behavior. Certainly when I worked at ABC News, I worked with Matt Lauer, but it was thought of differently. I mean, part of it is also, it's easy now to look back in hindsight with sort of clarity, but we were just oh, Matt's a womanizer. We knew he slept with staff, but we didn't see it as problematic in a weird way, right? We were just oh, well, that's just a thing men in power do. They just sleep with junior staff. It's one of the perks. And, you just tried to figure out as a woman how to navigate that world and how to, maneuver through it. But the reality is we all sort of just accepted these behaviors as like part of the cost of being in a working environment with these men. That was just how it was.
Can I drill down a little bit in that as like being in the sort of the news, the belly of the news beats, and how cultural news was made and packaged. So did it, I mean, when you look back on how you perceived it, how you and your colleagues, and from my experience when I would do hits on TV, so there were a lot of young women in producing jobs, right? And like, was it an internalized patriarchy, or were there sometimes like conversations was like, this feels wrong, or like, how do you recall it feeling, especially with the top-down messaging that was coming when, say, Diane Sawyer or Katie Couric may have been the ones who were doing the interviews?
So I should mention here that I've worked for both Diane Sawyer and Katie Couric. I have sort of like a long history of famous blondes. So Tina Brown, Jess and I both Tina Brown, so I sort of have a lot of context for that. I mean, I do think there's an internalized patriarchy, right? Like if you look at Diane and Katie and Tina, they came up through a system where they were sort of told that there was only like one way to be, and there were very few opportunities. And they did, to some degree, internalize those things. And I think Katie, to some degree, admitted that in her book recently, right? That she sort of accepted a certain amount of like scarcity in the way that she operated with other women. And I think for Diane, when I look back, and she's really been getting a lot of shit, right, for her interview, not just with Britney Spears, but also an interview she did with Whitney Houston, the famous sort of crack is whack interview. And I think the thing that it's like hard to remember now is that at the time, there was a lot more gatekeeping, right? Like if you were Britney Spears and you had an album coming out, or the paparazzi was hounding you, you had to go to a Diane Sawyer or a Matt Lauer to reach your audience. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram. You didn't have an unmediated way to like get your version of events out. And so I think, I don't want to speak for Diane, but I think to some degree, those interviews were seen as business transactions. Like everyone was there to do a job. Her job was to get people to talk about these really salacious things that were being said about them. And they were trading that discomfort because they needed the access to the audience. They needed to get their version of the story out. There was a certain sort of like mercenary aspect of it. So I think, it's easy now to sort of condemn her. But the reality is, if you put yourself in her position, I think like she was part of a system. She was a product of a system that sort of taught her that her value was to extract like sort of this from other women. And I don't know, we
all consumed it. The rest of us consumed it and gave it blockbuster ratings. I don't know that it's actually fair to just condemn the interviewers in many of these cases. Like that's so much of what this is about, is that we all consumed these narratives and these storylines.
Also, we know from we know from other things, but we also know from the morning show, right? There's a producer in their ear, right? Yeah. There's a team providing a binder. There's there are network executives discussing what they want from the interview. Like it is very much a sausage that is being made according to sausage factory protocol. So I obviously, Diane, Katie, I, as you know, I didn't say so in my own sort of introduction, but I'm a former media reporter, covered all this stuff, the infamous Katie Diane showdowns of 05 and 06. Much hay is made of that, the way that there was not made of comparing male anchors, et cetera. But it is just so interesting, just going back and looking at this stuff. You mentioned Whitney Houston. We talked about this a little bit in our pre-interview email exchange about we're seeing a lot of these narratives redeeming sort of young blonde women and who were famously mistreated, but also you also talk about Janet Jackson. There's a documentary coming out on Lifetime, I believe, shortly about re-examining that. But are these narratives primarily looking at the redemption arcs around white women, or we're also seeing Black women infamously treated poorly, as numerous examples will show? I guess you had also mentioned like Anita Hill reframing that. Jessica.
I mean, I think this is really like, I feel like we should back up a little bit. Why are we here? We're here because Susie and I are developing a podcast that's trying to look at some of these cultural moments from the past and unpack them through a modern day lens. That has, of course, been elevated in the culture in recent years with regard to individuals. And I think some of the most prominent individuals have been women like Anita Hill, who has completely, this is a woman who, during the election, people were recounting what she had endured back in the 90s when the Clarence Thomas hearings, which are also often referred to as the Anita Hill hearings, she was put on the stand and she was questioned and her sanity was called into question. And there was discussion of her being into all sorts of crazy satanic sex. And she was called by David Brock, the conservative pundit, quote, a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty. And that was repeated and printed in every mainstream newspaper. And, she sort of quietly continued and endured and persevered and became a law professor and was very respected by her students. But years ago, when I was reporting on her, she mentioned that most of her students didn't even know that past about her. And I think what we've seen through a feature film and then a documentary and through her latest book, and now this sort of public discussion, is Anita Hill, the scholar, the woman who is one of the greatest experts on gender violence globally. And so I think she's a really good example. But I think in all of these cases, Black women in particular got it worse. Like we discussed, Susie and I were talking about in 2006, when I was like a junior reporter at Newsweek, was when the magazine published their sort of now infamous, I wish I could show it to you, Girls Gone Wild cover. And it was Britney and Paris and Lindsay like falling over with, the roots of the hair, looking totally tousled, streaked mascara. And at the time I was like, what is this cover? Like, this is a national news magazine where we talk about important things. And there's this cover called Girls Gone Wild when we like basically never put women on the cover at all. But at least those white women were getting covers, even if it was negative. Black women at that time, and not until not that long ago, were being told they couldn't get covers at all. Like that was the thing that Beyonce was explicitly told in the Destiny's Child era. So I think that we are starting to see a lot of these things bubble up, and it's within this larger cultural context of us realizing that, everything from the birth of our nation, which we now know as 1619, to the story of women getting the right to vote and who was behind that, are actually much more complex and much more diverse than we've been previously taught.
Yeah, another example that we've been talking about lately, which is just fascinating, is Vanessa Williams, right? Vanessa Williams was the first Black Miss America. That's a huge accomplishment.
So most people don't know she was a Miss America before she became a singer. And I feel like, mixed accomplishment, whatever you feel about Miss America.
Like a lot of people sort of know her from TV, right? Like know her, I think she was on Desperate Housewives, and I think she was on Ugly Betty, right? So she sort of went on to have this career, but she was forced to resign because, like, I think 2 weeks before the end of her reign, these pictures came out. She had worked for a photographer. He had convinced her to pose nude for some photos. They were like black and white artistic photos. They weren't, not that it would have made it okay if they had been, more salacious, but they were fairly unsalacious photos if you look at them now, certainly by today's standards. But at the time, she was forced to resign. The first Black Miss America was forced to resign and sort of treated as that, like she literally had to come forward and say, because in one of the pictures she was with another woman, I am not a slut and I am not a lesbian, right? Because those two things would make it impossible for her to have a career. And so that was like the soundbite that everybody used from her resignation. And, where is her sort of like, retrospective, right? Where is Vanessa getting to sort of tell her own story? I think there's definitely a lot of stories that we haven't gotten to yet, right?
I mean, that's I would love to see the Vanessa Williams story, actually. When you talk about where people know her from, musical theater, people would know her from playing the witch in a revival about a decade ago of Into the Woods. And one of the lines the witch says in Act 2 to the narrator who tells the story, and he says, "Hey, don't blame me. I'm just telling the story." She says, "Some of us don't like the way you've been telling it." So I Stephen
perfect.
And James Lapine ahead of the curve in 1984 with Into the Woods. But Jessica, when you mentioned Beyonce, it's interesting because the Girls Gone Wild cover came out on Newsweek in early 2007, and Beyonce starred in Dreamgirls, which came out Oscar season December 2006. Dreamgirls is the story of what Black performers did and had to do in order to cross over. It's just the context all over the place is fascinating, and I do want to also point out context from the Anita Hill story, which is the Clarence Thomas story. It's also the Joe Biden story.
Yeah,
Biden, now the president.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
But then he was actually finally asked to answer for it, right? I mean, I think that's what was like interesting to see in this election is that people were like, Joe Biden needs to apologize to Anita Hill. I mean, did you think we'd ever see the day like that he would? Yeah, and then he didn't, which was also bizarre. Like, I just sort of didn't understand what it would cost him to just like apologize to her completely.
Take any ownership of what might have been done differently. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack because it's literally decades and it's literally everything. So I'm glad you're doing this podcast. When can we listen to it? When is it going to be out?
We're developing it now. And to be clear, like one of the things, both of our work, I think, and mine in particular has for a number of years focused on these various characters and these women. But the way that this podcast idea came together was actually talking more specifically about pop culture we consume. So for instance, General Hospital, many people watched this in the 80s. I think the thing we were talking about was 81, which is when I was born. So I was like a little bit younger, but there's that famous couple in General Hospital, Luke and Laura, who get married. And as Susie reminded me recently, their relationship began with Luke raping Laura on the show.
Like a college rape, right? Not like ambiguous, whatever. Like literally she was raped and then she went to a rape crisis counselor on the
And then
show.
like they had a fairy tale wedding and it was like the most viewed episode of all time. And we were just like, wait, so we like watched this growing up. And what did that tell us about ourselves and about what was okay? And like, what was going on in the culture at the time that was considered okay? And we started sort of unraveling this and unpacking this. And Susie, what did you find out about how it saved the show, right?
It saved the show. So the story, it really is fascinating. So the story of Luke and Laura's wedding, which was kind of this, like, I think 30 million people watched it. It was like the highest rated soap opera episode of all time. And also, by the way, Princess Diana sent a bottle of champagne to this fake wedding. And Elizabeth Taylor insisted on doing a cameo. So, I mean, that's how big a sort of cultural event it was. People stayed home from work to watch it, like whatever. So this huge cultural event started because the show was actually tanking. It wasn't doing well. And so they decided to sort of take this risk of introducing this rape as like a salacious storyline. And they felt like the audience was responding to it. And what they decided to do with that response, because the whole idea was he was supposed to rape her and then die 2 weeks later. But they not only decided to keep him alive, they decided to slowly sort of morph the situation into having been a seduction. They sort of just like kind of pretended that those early episodes hadn't happened. And then in a really bizarre twist, the song that was playing while he raped her became the #1 song in America. Like,
what song was it?
It was called Rise. It's like this weird sort of like disco.
You would recognize it. It can't I heard it recently when I was in a car.
Not like a great song. You're not like, oh, I get it. Like, I can't believe
sort of like a disco track.
It was just this weird cultural moment, right? And I think it did sort of teach girls that like rape is ambiguous. Sometimes it's seduction. He was just so in love with her. He couldn't help himself. He thought he was dying. So it was like a sort of profession of love. And, the fact is that General Hospital has actually dealt with it. I mean, this was such an obvious weirdness that they have through the years actually like had the characters discuss it, right? At some point they had the children, Luke and Laura's children, find out that their dad had raped their mom, like an episode about that. But like, those are like the messages we internalize, right? We were girls and we were just like watching television and we we're like, oh, this is how it works. Like, this is how love affairs start. And maybe that's not a conscious thing you think, but that's the messaging you're getting, right? As a girl growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and probably to some degree today with different kinds of stories, right?
So I actually sort of like watched the Luke and Laura wedding live.
Yeah.
Oh, you did?
I did.
You and like millions of other people. Yeah.
But I didn't remember the storyline from like how they got together, but I definitely remember the iconic wedding. We watched General Hospital and then Y&R, Young and the Restless. And I mean, if we just got used to like consuming shocking content because of soap operas, that actually makes a lot of sense. I remember my very first, when I started tuning into Young and the Restless, because whatever, my sister was watching it or something. It was when I think Victor Newman, iconic Victor Newman, had like locked his wife's lover in the basement or something. That's like, I remember this so clearly. His name was Michael. Point being is that really, where were the gatekeepers? Where was the moral majority at that point?
Right.
Because yes,
it's just hilarious. I mean, yeah, some of these things are more shocking than others, but once you start noticing this kind of thing, it's like every piece of media that we consumed growing up, like every song I listened to in high school, Dawson's Creek, like every single thing has something about it, whether it's a portrayal of race or how we think about consent or LGBTQ issues and transit. Like there is something about it that you're like, oh my God, through today's eyes, this seems sort of bonkers. And it's fascinating to unpack those things and to try to understand, if they really had an effect on us, or in some cases, like with all of these remakes coming out right now, if they can be resolved, or if it just ends up like Sex and the City being like a sad, woke version of itself.
So, I mean, I find Sex and the City I know Rachel feels the same way, so I'm going to let her weigh in on this too. But I feel like what they've done with Sex and the City is actually kind of a travesty. I mean, I'm still watching every week because I just like can't look away. But the reality is that, the characters on Sex and the City were aspirational, and whatever you thought of that, or whether or not you thought they should be aspirational, they were sort of like interesting women who were portrayed in ways that women didn't really get portrayed at the time, right? They were able to talk openly about sex or whatever. And now they're these sort of like sad, like weird, vaguely like racist characters that you sort of feel like have been in a coma for 20 years, right? Like, I'm like, why is Miranda such a weirdo? Like Miranda, who was this like interesting woman, a lawyer, like whatever, they've turned her into this like weird sad sack who like didn't know about anything to do with Black people until she took this like one class and then managed to be like deeply offensive in the first thing. And then the idea of having paired every character with like, one
their
token
handbag equivalent, their token, handbag equivalent of
really ham-fisted. Like, I think the thing is that yes, when you look back on Sex and the City, there's definitely some weird cultural things. Like the whole trip to Dubai, the whole second movie was this sort of like weird, vaguely racist, anti-Middle Eastern like mess. But the solution wasn't to sort of be like, and so now all four of these women are weird one-dimensional cutouts of sort of like sad, unwoke, like has-beens, I mean, like poor Sarah Jessica Parker, who acts like podcasting was invented like this year. Like she's like, look at this podcast I'm on. And I'm like, podcasts have been around for kind of a while. Why is it so shocking? Like literally they have this scene where Miranda's like, who listens to podcasts? I'm like, I'm pretty
Everyone.
sure Miranda would have,
Right.
There are many ways in which the characters as they are presented now are inconsistent with both what we knew about the characters intimately, because that's what the show asked of us, right? The show did won Emmys for character development and for having these women proceed through their lives, and we joined them in that. And so on the one hand, we know these characters. On the other hand, we know the times we're in, and we know the people that we are, the people we're around, and we also know, because we know media, we know that podcasts enjoy a great degree of media penetration, right? So those are the things, those are the details that I have found bewildering, that really attack my own suspension of disbelief, because I'm just like, Miranda would for sure be listening to the Daily. Miranda would be the one who'd be sending around like the latest feminist outrage article du jour to her friends, or be in a text chat and be like, see what Tracer wrote today.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think that sort of gets to the heart of this, which is that, just because this media told us like a certain version of stories, I don't think we have to like throw it away and try and like reinvent it in this like weird, sad way. Like, like we talk about 16 Candles, right? Which if you rewatch as an adult, you're like, there's pretty much a date rape in this, right? Like there's a passed out woman, he has sex with her, she doesn't remember it, and then she still like has to reassure him that it was a good time. So that's a really twisted thing. But I don't like want to throw out 16 Candles, right? I mean, it was a huge part of the way that I like sort of envisioned, like, like I wanted to be Molly Ringwald with the guy who gets you the cake or whatever. I think we're grown-ups, so we can look back on this content and sort of take from it the good parts and sort of acknowledge that it reflects a moment. And then that moment shaped us, right? And that we don't have to throw that away. It's really just like to do the work of asking, how did it shape us, and how are we doing now? Are we doing any better? Which I think, sometimes we are and sometimes we're not.
Can we go to, are we doing any better now? We talked a little bit about Yellow Jackets, because it has just gotten so much buzz, and because part of it is anchored in the 90s, and it's anchored in today. And it's just, in many accounts, it's sort of like, for those who don't know, and I feel like a lot of people know, it is sort of like the high school girls soccer team version of Lord of the Flies. Team is on the way to nationals, plane crash, forest, no oversight, devolution into survival of the fittest / worst instincts and impulses. I will leave it at that. But it's just the reason I raised it with both of you. And actually, I was too scared to watch, even though I have watched the pilot, and I've done a lot of peeking through my hands at clips and reading articles. But the reason I wanted to ask you about it is because it kind of represents if this is what we are doing now, or what is being hailed as like how young women, girls are being portrayed, and also how their lives in 1996 were being portrayed. What does that say about the lens that we're looking through? And I guess particularly,
is anyone saying that? I like it. It's nostalgic. It's fun. I like there's Liz Phair on Smashing Pumpkins in the first episode. Like, great. I'm on board. I grew up in Seattle in the 90s. But I don't know I feel like there's a gap. Like, we can't look at that and say, are we representing women better today? I don't know. It's like, it's fantastical. I mean, like, I guess you could call it progress that like women too are slaughtering and cannibalizing their fellow soccer teammates or whatever.
Hey, ratifying the ERA can't be far behind.
And yeah, there needs to be complex, evil women is progress too. And the portrayal of evil women. But I don't know. I just sort of think of it as like a fun, gory nostalgia watch.
I haven't watched it, so I can't weigh in on that. But I will say that, like, when we've talked about this with other people, and someone raised Kim Kardashian as an example of sort of like how we talk about famous women today, and we've, thought a lot about that since that. And I think Kim is kind of an example of the way we talk about women. I think, you see the way Kim has become famous, the Kardashians in general, and they have certainly owned their own story more in some ways than like a Jessica Simpson, right? Who basically that reality show experience made her want to stop being famous essentially. And she kind of just like retreated and doesn't really do any acting or singing anymore and just mostly runs her fashion business, which Bloomberg did a big article about this week. But look, I mean, the way people talk about the Kardashians is really complicated and sort of like dismissive and rude in a way that we just don't talk about men who become famous in the same way, right? We just don't sort of dismiss them as empty-headed idiots who are, you know, just like have this mother who made them famous. Like they, you know, whatever you think of them, they have like defined a lot of the sort of pop culture of the last 10 years. I mean, the way every woman looks, like every influencer on Instagram looks like a Kardashian on some level, right? There's like some amount of just like, they've changed like the physicality of the country in some ways, right? And so the idea that, you know, we're doing better is complicated. I think we are doing better in some cases. And it's easier to look back in hindsight and be like, oh, we did, like we, you know, when you look at how these people were covered, it wasn't great. But I don't know that it's so easy to do it as it's happening because you're in it, right? So it's like, how easy is it to sort of back up and say, well, you know, this is what it would be like to write a real profile of Kim Kardashian that didn't sort of like treat her in some part as a joke, because that is sort of how people treat her.
Well, also it's like, she doesn't need someone to write a profile of her because she has her own audience. It's going to be bigger than any audience I, for example, could ever reach.
Right.
And I think that's when, you know, with regard to famous people or people with a built-in online following, they can now speak directly to their audiences in a way that they couldn't prior, what you were saying about gatekeepers.
Yeah.
So that, I think, for those in those positions is probably better. They can be their authentic selves and they don't have to filter it through the lens of whomever is writing the story. But like you said, it's it's complicated. I mean, yeah, the fact that the literal face has morphed to look more like a plastic version of itself may not necessarily be a good thing. You can feel about that however you want, but there's no denying that people like the Kardashians have influence, even if you don't like what that influence is.
Yeah. It's amazing just when you said like the literal changing of the physicality.
Yeah.
That is definite influence. And just you're so right about the, you know, Kim Kardashian having her own audience such that when she went on SNL, it was like, oh, it's so cute to talk to like an intimate little group of people. But that brings us back to Britney. The Britney's Instagram as her own outlet, and her DGAF one at that. It's I'm at work right now, so if you Google DGAF. But I guess before we open it up to questions, it does feel right to return to Britney because Britney's story for us, for her, for media, for recontextualizing, kind of like pulls in all the things that we have been talking about. So I guess before we open it up to questions, any closing thoughts on, in retrospect, all of this, everything? Yeah, no, I did not set that up very well.
No, that's fine. Jess, do you want to go first? I feel like I've talked so much.
My closing thoughts on retrospect. I mean, I just think it's fascinating to look at some of the things that were ingrained in us through culture growing up and try to unpack and unravel and understand like how that affected who we are today. And like it did have an effect. And we're not just talking about women, we're talking about anyone who consumed this type of culture. You know, there's obviously like so much debate now about separating the art from the artist and like, can you listen to problematic music and should so-and-so be canceled? And you know, I'm not here to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't consume, but I think, like Susie said earlier, you should go in with a level of literacy and understanding what the messages you are ingesting are and mean. And they do have impact. Like we know that there's study after study after study that shows that the more media people consume, the less options they believe they have in life. That was a stat from the Gina Davis Institute that looked at young girls and young boys. And the girls specifically thought they had less options, whereas the boys, saw that they could be so many different things and pursued that. But this stuff matters. And I think it's really interesting to look back and to reflect.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think like it's our history. It's our shared history, right? And I think, one thing that's like very useful for me is I sometimes watch this stuff with my niece who's 22 and just like seeing her reaction, seeing the way she consumes the same material. Like she'll call me and be like, oh my God, like she's rewatching The Real Housewives of New York from the beginning. And she's constantly calling me and being like, oh my God, like this is so racist. And then she'll send me a clip and I'll be like, oh God, that is so racist, or like she'll, she just like, we watched the Matt Lauer interview and with Britney Spears together and she just couldn't get over that like Matt Lauer of all people was the one giving Britney a hard time about being a bad mom. Right. And so I think part of it is also there's like a whole generation of women and men, right, who didn't necessarily grow up on this stuff, who are kind of fascinated to see it, right? Like, kind of are like
discovering it for the first time.
What you guys were doing.
Like, no wonder you're so fucked up. Yeah, totally.
So I think that's also like it's fun to kind of see it through the eyes of people who didn't grow up with it in the way we did, because sometimes I feel like I just missed it when it was happening in real time. Like she'll show me stuff from The Real Housewives of New York and I'll be like, I have no memory of that, but yeah, that's fucked up. And it's just like was the way it was. I was rewatching The Golden Girls after Betty White died, and there was this bizarre scene where they had to take one of them to the hospital, and Blanche turns around and says, oh, thank God she'll be okay. Her doctor's a Jew. I'm like, that's interesting. You know what I mean? Like,
there was a thing there was something going around on Instagram today that was like an image of the Golden Girls next to an image of Sex and the City. Maybe you all saw this too, where it was like they were the same age at the times these were filmed, and just seeing like the dress, the hairstyle, the level of plastic surgery, like the way that we thought about them as old versus whatever, was fascinating.
Oh, there's like an interesting point being made about Disney movies. Yeah. I mean, there's so much in Disney movies. And
Little Mermaid. You can win your man without saying a single word. Yeah. Let's literally take away your voice. Yeah. And that is how.
As long as you're pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I haven't really rewatched the Disney movies with a critical eye, but I'm sure if you do, there's just like so much. I mean, Beauty and the Beast is basically about someone with Stockholm syndrome, right?
She's happy to
literally kidnapped.
Happy to report that I have a 6-year-old. And so we have gone through our Rapunzel era. That is, tried to make it very clear to my daughter that that's not love, locking someone up in a tower. The Little Mermaid era, Beauty and the Beast. Just the imprisonment, Stockholm syndrome vibes there are shocking, and also like the again and again this sympathy. The villain is Gaston, also a villain to be clear, but the Beast is given like a hard pass on a lot.
Kidnaps her, right? So that's like that seems also villainous on some level.
When it starts to get to like Moana, I'm down with Moana. We haven't seen Encanto yet. My daughter, God bless her, she corrected my pronunciation. She made sure I said Encanto. But like in these stories are developing, but even like there was a lot with Frozen, and Frozen was great in a lot of ways. And all of this has like, I'm a musical theater person, so I love all the music, but examining all of these stories. Oh, and the best is when my daughter got super into Beauty and the Beast. It's Sleeping Beauty, like the old school version. And I'm just like, okay, just because someone kisses you while you're asleep doesn't mean you marry them. Doesn't mean it's okay. None of it's okay. So yeah, that's a whole other world.
I mean, there's a career in here for someone to create the literacy the media literacy handbooks to go with each of these things to talk through while you're watching with your child what each thing means.
Well, and it's like funny, right? Because we grew up sort of being like, oh, fairy tales are so, I mean, we sort of even we knew, right? Like when we were growing up, that fairy tales were sort of like corrosive, right? That they sort of taught you a view of like what romantic relationships should be that weren't like totally right. But, you know, when you really think about it, like the Luke and Laura wedding was a fairy tale for many people, right? Like we sort of know that traditional fairy tales are distorted. What we sort of forget is that the fairy tale, like the pop culture fairy tales we were told were also distorted, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to think about it as a continuum from that, which is like, you know, you start out being told that like you need to wait for Prince Charming and he's going to just like find you asleep and like wake you up with his kiss. And then, you know, all the way through to, you know, what you consumed, like not just Luke and Laura, but like what we consumed up through the 2000s and even to some degree now, right? Of what it means to like find love and what that looks like and who gets to find love and who sort of gets shoved to the sidelines as like the quirky best friend, which is what I always like.
I mean, you can have an episode of this podcast every day, every hour. And speaking of that, we have a question from the viewers. What is the format of the podcast going to be?
So the format's going to be basically each week, Jess and I will unpack sort of one of these moments. We'll kind of remind you of what you knew, but also of some things you probably didn't know that were going on behind the scenes. A great example of that is Fatal Attraction, where Glenn Close, you know, really fought hard because in the original Fatal Attraction, both her and Michael Douglas were punished for the affair. It was like a morality tale where both people who transgress were punished. And then when they showed it to test audiences, they didn't like that. They just wanted to see Glenn Close killed. And so they decided to make that change, and Glenn Close like spent all this time fighting that and lost the battle, and sort of like this archetype of the bunny boiler was born, right? So we'll tell you a little bit about sort of what we consumed and also what was going on behind the scenes and who was sort of like getting to tell the story. And then we're going to try and have a guest each week who sort of lived through it in some capacity, who participated in the event, to tell us a bit about what it was like. So that's the format, but we're open to any suggestions or thoughts if people just from watching this have ideas.
Yeah, nominations.
Yeah.
Episode nominations.
Just the nominations.
Let's see. Clayton asked, how do you think today's content will be viewed in 20 years? Yeah, I mean, it's like that's how progress works, right? Like, of course, today's content will probably still be viewed as problematic, though hopefully we'll have stopped using that word. I hate that word. It's so unspecific. But I don't know. I think that who is making the content has changed dramatically. And even thinking back to like me as a junior reporter at Newsweek magazine, when that Girls Gone Wild cover came out and I had no power inside the institution. And for what it's worth, that was a cover story that was written by women. But I think that the people making the media now and analyzing the media and critiquing the media and creating the storylines and the plots look different than they did then. And so hopefully we're getting to a place where, you know, we're better representing society rather than a small sect of it.
I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is that of course there's content coming out now that's, you know, for lack of a better word, problematic, right? Because it gets called out in real time now, right? Like there's a much stronger feedback loop, I think. And I think that has changed the way stories get received, which is sort of gets to the point of the, you know, do you feel like someone like the Kardashians has set themselves up to better avoid salacious rumors? Like to some degree, yes. I think this Pete Davidson thing is very much being controlled by Kim Kardashian. She sort of made the decision of what about this she wants out and how she wants it out and what story it's telling about herself. And I think, but to some degree that's Kim Kardashian, but she still is such like a sort of tabloid figure that I think I'm sure there are stories that get told about her that she would prefer to have kind of left behind. But look at someone like a Beyonce, right? Who completely has locked down her public image, doesn't do interviews, handpicks the people who do the interviews with her. Like she has sort of realized that she does not need to communicate with her audience in the way that traditional artists felt like they had to have an audience. And she's completely set up a different way of being a superstar. And I think it's kind of remarkable. Like it's impressive what she's been able to achieve and how much of herself she's been able to hold back and still be sort of like one of the biggest stars of our time.
Yeah, I mean, the tabloids do not have power in the way that they did now. And so that's an avoidable thing as well that I think differentiates a lot of the pop stars today from the 90s or early 2000s.
I think that's right.
I guess that that's a note to end on, only because it's 12:57. And it feels like, if we don't stop now, then we're just going to keep going, because there's so much to unpack. I do think, though, that sort of landing on that, which is an acknowledgement of a power shift and of the shift not only in gatekeepers but in types of media, right? We went from an era where network television reigned supreme, talking through sort of when we talking through the 90s is talking through the rise of cable, and really haven't even talked about radio and the impact that radio has and has had on the cultural landscape and the political landscape right now, and how divided things are. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about when you're talking about media, types of media, and the rise of different forms, and querying whether or not that democratization of media, how exactly has that democratized and what kind of effect that's had. That is, I mean, these are all things I can't wait to hear everything that you talk about on your podcast. And I love this conversation. I could just sit and talk to you for hours, which is in point. Something that we've already done, because I loved our text exchanges and our emails. Where can everyone find you to learn about all of your storytelling, all of your thoughts, your bon mots, and the launch of the podcast?
Well, as you already pointed out, Twitter is probably the place that I'm most active. I have an Instagram account. You're welcome to follow it. It's all pictures of this dog. It's all pictures of my puppy, who's named Dolly Parton. If you haven't already seen that I'm obsessed with pop culture of some kind. So Twitter's probably the way. And I promise not to let you up if you follow me on Twitter. And now I'm going to go back and find out what Rachel's talking about.
I just put it in. And Jess, you're Jessica Bennett on all platforms, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember the days when you were Jess 7 Ben, right?
Oh my God. Yeah. Really upgraded my personal brand. Yeah.
Put that
also,
in there.
Thank you. Wait, I'm going to fix the spelling of my last name, but, oh no, it's okay. It's a long
Sorry.
No worries. But also thank you for everyone who came to this and spent an hour in the middle of their day listening to us. We always appreciate that. We think it's lovely that people want to listen to us talk. At least I do. No one's more surprised than I am, really.
And thank you
Thanks for having us, Rach.
Oh my gosh. It's as you know, it's my great pleasure and honor, and I'm super grateful, especially in this format, because it was supposed to be live. And thank you, everybody, for joining us in Saxworks Online. I hope you are in a happy, plant-filled space of your own, and I can't wait to welcome you back to one of ours. We have 2 locations in New York, Brookfield Place downtown, and the Saks flagship on the 10th floor of Saks Fifth Avenue, and just opened in Greenwich, Connecticut on Greenwich Avenue, Saxworks Greenwich, soon to be opening in Manhasset, and then the world. Please come in. You can get a complimentary day pass. We are happy to send you one. We can drop one in the chat, I think. Or you know what? We'll put it. Why don't you just go to Saxworks on Twitter? I won't get that wrong, Susie. Sax_works on Twitter, and it's just Saxworks on Instagram. So I will post one of those. We will post one of those. And please come see us, join us, and tell your friends, I guess. And then tell them to listen to In Retrospect, which we will also make sure to share widely and loudly when it launches. And can't wait, and honored to have been part of, I guess, the pre-interview process for that. Or Susie and Jess, thank you. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. Stay safe.